So what do these principles of loving God and loving neighbour look like in Paul's life? In 1 Thessalonians 2 verses 1 to 8, we hear Paul, Silas and Timothy writing to a church that they had planted in Thessalonica. And when they'd planted the church, of course, the three missionaries were the only models of the Christian life which the new believers had. So it was crucial that those three reflected the double commandment to love God and to love neighbour. So let's look at how they did that. Notice their motives. They were focused on loving and pleasing God. In verse 2, we had courage in our God to declare the gospel of God to you. This overrode their fear of suffering. As he says in verse 2, that they'd been shamefully mistreated at Philippi. At Philippi they had great suffering. In fact, they'd been thrown in jail before they came to Thessalonica. And they might have approached Thessalonica by saying, well, maybe it's going to be as terrible as it was in Philippi. But no, says Paul, we had courage in our God to declare the gospel. God was the source of our strength. Not only that, but in verse 4 he says, we've been approved by God to be entrusted with the message of the gospel. We've been authorised by God for the task. And like good soldiers who've been authorised by our superior, we want to please our commanding officer. We want to please God. So verse 4 again, we speak, he says, not to please mortals, but to please God who tests our hearts. This is a response to God's love. Their hearts are given over to the same love for God as he has for them. They want to please God. They want to make God happy. So they say, we do things with God in mind. Verse 5, as you know, and as God is our witness, we never came with words of flattery. They know the key audience for what they do is not the Thessalonians, but God himself. That's how to think about the way you live. You're performing, you're living for an audience of one, the Lord himself. So they love people by telling them the truth in verse 5. We came not with words of flattery or a pretext for greed. Verse 4, we spoke the gospel of God, the message of the gospel. Verse 2, we had courage to declare the gospel of God. Now it's easy to be tempted to tell people something comfortable and easy. It's a constant temptation for politicians. But Paul and Silas and Timothy avoided that. They focused on sharing the gospel of God. Verse 8 again, we determined to share with you not only the gospel of God, but also our lives. If we truly love our neighbours, we'll speak of Christ to them, Paul says. So that's their motives. Love for God and love for the people. Their method was an interesting contrast. In Paul's day, there were many travelling orators, travelling speakers who went around, and they went to a place and they spoke in order to raise money and in order maybe to be hired as a tutor to a child in a rich family. But Paul says, look at our motives. Verse 3, our appeal doesn't spring from deceit or impure motives or trickery. We're not trying to con you. We speak, verse 5, not with words or flattery or with a pretext for greed. We're not doing this to make money, says Paul. If we wanted to make money, there are many other things we could have done. Verse 6, we're not seeking praise from mortals, whether you or others. We're not seeking human applause. No, we're not like those people. In fact, we're courageous, verse 2. We've courage to declare the gospel in the spite of past suffering and present opposition. Remember, they've been thrown in jail in Philippi and beaten. And in Acts 17 we learn the story of their ministry in Thessalonica, where they're only able to stay quite a short time, and Paul had to run for his life when the Jews opposed him and roused a mob against him. So there's a contrast with the travelling orators or speakers, but there's also this picture in verse 7 of being gentle, like a nurse tenderly caring for her own children. It was very common for wealthy families to hire a woman to care for their children, a bit like a nanny. And she became not just an employee, but a member of the family. She shared her life with the family. And Paul's comparing herself to that kind of woman. Interesting that he's using a female image. And when he says a nurse tenderly caring for her own children, that word that's used is used elsewhere for a bird sitting on its eggs to keep them warm. Or it's used sometimes for a person who's caring for someone who's ill. Paul, Silas and Timothy's focus was on the nurture and the growth of the people they cared for. Now, it doesn't mean there's never time for rebuke or tough words, but it sets priorities. Plutarch, who was a first century writer, puts it like this: when children fall down, the nurses do not rush up to berate them, but they take them up, wash them, and straighten their clothes, and after all this is done, then rebuke and punish them. That's a really interesting observation from Plutarch in an essay called How to Tell a Flatterer from a Friend. Paul's final picture in verse 8 is that we shared not only the gospel of God, but also our very selves, because you have become very dear to us. Paul, Silas and Timothy let these people into their lives. They loved their neighbours like they did themselves. Life is strange at the moment, isn't it? Because it's harder than usual to let people into our lives. But this is a call to us to be creative about how we love other people, so that we can open our lives and share them with others. A Chinese woman who became a Christian while studying a university in the UK said of her Christian friend who shared the gospel with her that her friend built a bridge of friendship and Jesus walked across that bridge into her life. Now that's what Paul, Silas and Timothy do. They build a bridge by sharing themselves with these people, and Jesus walks across that bridge into their lives. So, love, 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 love. Jesus points us to God's great love for us, and he calls us to love in return, to wholehearted, exclusive love for God, and committed, open love for those around us. Let's pray, and let's think and act that we'll be those kinds of people.